Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Conservation Conversations. My name is Ana Sangronis, and I will be your host this afternoon for our third conversation of the new year, featuring Ed Pritchard, who will be talking about the wading birds of South Florida. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing later. All of you are currently muted with your videos off, so we ask that you type any questions that you may have into the chat box. We look forward to a very interesting conversation. And before I forget, these webinars are taking place on the second Wednesday of the month, at this point through May of this year, at that time we'll discuss and reevaluate what the schedule might look like beyond that point. In April, we will be featuring a presentation by a guest speaker on the Miami blue butterfly. So just for now, let that percolate in the back of your mind, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to my friend and colleague, Ed Pritchard.
Great, thanks so much, Anna. Thank you guys again for joining us. I'm excited to talk to you guys today about some of our feathery friends here in South Florida, the wading birds. As Anna mentioned, we will have this recording, so if you want to share this or check it out again, because there are some cool, interesting facts in here that will be helpful moving forward. So again, my name is Ed Pritchard. I work for Miami Eco Adventures. We're a division of Miami-Dade County Parks, Rec, and Open Spaces Department. I'm based here at Crandon Park, a coastal park here in Key Biscayne. I'm a program lead here and the site manager. So we'll jump right into it. So an overview of just what we're going to discuss today in today's conservation conversations. We're going to start with the taxonomy and the anatomy of our wading bird species. We're going to go into depth about the ones we see here in South Florida and talk a little bit about their appearance. Then we'll jump into their habitat, behavior, and their nesting areas. Then we'll talk about some of the threats to them, both past and current. A little bit more about conservation, what's going on locally to help these populations. And then a little bit into just how you as a public can view some of these species. So starting off, just kind of wanted to go over, birds in Florida. A lot of people come from around the world to the Florida Peninsula to view the rich diversity of bird life that we have here. It's home to more than 500 species. Both year-round as well as migratory species. And they're found all the way from the mangrove islands in the Keys and the dry tortugas all the way up to the Florida Panhandle. And they're range in size from tiny hummingbirds to painted buntings to predatory hawks like the osprey. Quite a diversity. We have the snail kite here, the swallowtail kite, the brown pelican, and then we have some endangered species that are endemic to Florida, such as the Cape Sable seaside sparrow, and some of the wading birds we'll talk about today are also threatened. So we do have quite a variety. As I mentioned, it's also an important migratory stopover for a lot of birds. So Florida is located along the Atlantic Flyway. That's an important migratory route for a number of species. That's from the northern area, so up near the Arctic Circle, Arctic tundra, down along the eastern seaboard, and then these birds are headed into the Caribbean as well as into Central and South America. So it's a very important flyway. Florida's kind of like that last stopover before they make that big jump across the Caribbean. And again, these birds are moving through. We have our fall migrations as well as right now we're kind of in between. We have our spring migration coming up here soon. So, again, Florida, we talk about how Florida is important, not just for these birds, but when we look at, our economy and tourism, there's quite a bit of money coming into our economy because of birding and people, these folks that are extreme birders, the ones that have a list that they're checking off, they come to Florida to find these birds. So real quickly, just the classification. We have birds in the class Aves. They are vertebrates, so the feathers is what distinguishes them from other animals. But as a vertebrate and as a mammal, they're warm-blooded, endothermic, and they can live in both warm and cold climates. Breaking it down even further, we have 9,000 species of birds in 27 orders. So to classify that, taxonomists most often use things like beaks, feet, the plumage, bone structure, even your musculature to distinguish them into these orders. So today we're going to talk about the Siconiformes, which is our wading bird order. Again, that's different than, there's birds that are associated with watery habitats that fall into a few different orders. We have things like ducks and geese. Those fall into Anseriformes. And then we also have Sherardiformes, which are, our seabirds, our shorebirds, like the sandpipers and seagulls. So those kind of fall into a different order. But today, again, we're going to talk about the wading birds in the Siconiformes category, in that order. So before we move on, I just want to do a quick poll, if Anna doesn't mind launching our first poll. So the question is, which of these are characteristics of all wading birds? Are they all big-eyed and highly sensitive in terms of their hearing? Do they have big feet with spread out toes, webbed feet and a broad beak, or webbed feet and a slender beak? So whichever one you think, just select that option. Couple more seconds on that. All right, we'll wrap that up in just a sec. All right. So thank you for participating in that. So that being said, what is it that distinguishes wading birds? So again, we talk about our wading birds. They're often living in these areas with quite a bit of water. So the regions in South Florida specifically are wetland ecosystems. During our rainy season and even during the dry season, there's these areas of standing water. So wading birds have physical and behavioral adaptations for living on or near water. So with that poll question, their first adaptation is their those long, slender toes that are spread out. So that helps them with their, walking around in the squishy mud. It's easier for them with those thin toes to pick up and put down their feet as they're, again, they're wading through that water and they're trying to be as stealth as possible to find as they're foraging for their food. Those toes also serve the purpose of dispersing the weight of their body, helping them keep their balance. Again, wading through water, if you've ever done it, can be very taxing and trying to find your balance, and especially in that squishy mud or that sediment on the bottom can be tough. So that's what those toes do. So that is the long slender toes from that last question, as well as the long legs. So long legs help keep the feathers on these birds dry when they're wading through this water. And so they are able to walk through the water without, getting completely submerged. As opposed to some of our waterfowl like ducks and geese, they have special adaptations themselves to allow for that water not to, it basically rolls off a lot of their feathers when they get out of the water. So the wading birds use their long legs to help them when they're foraging. So we talked about their feet and toes. We'll move on to other adaptations that these wading birds have. With the legs, again, we talked about the long legs. They also have, unique bills that they have evolved in order to catch the prey that they're looking for. So in these pictures, you'll see kind of a variety of bills. The top left is our roseate spoonbill. Look at that, it kind of looks like a spatula. So these bills, are tailored for the type of habitat and the prey that they feed on. So the spoonbill here has that wide bill so that they can dig around in the soil and in the sediment to find the types of food that they're looking for. They can kind of probe around in there and, quickly, grab something and swallow it. And then we have birds like our herons and our egrets with these long, slender bills. And so these are helpful for them when they're trying to, they're more like cautious, silent hunters. So they're looking to like stab their prey in a quick, rapid motion. So these birds have this specially adapted beak, very sharp and very slender to grab those fish or that other prey. You'll also see kind of their neck. A lot of these birds have adapted necks for what they're looking for that they're preying upon. So these long, agile necks that you'll see on some of our herons and egrets, they have these distinct curves. These help them with their posture. It helps them, often change. They can move their head quickly from side to side to scan the water. And again, it's all about balance as well. Whereas opposed to some of these other birds like the spoonbill, they have this neck that's very powerful, very wide, and they have these neck muscles. We talked about musculature. These birds are able to, when they're wading, they can move that heavy bill from side to side in the water. So the neck is also another thing that distinguishes them apart from one another, and again, is adapted for their types of prey. And then lastly, the plumage. So again, larger wading birds often develop this elaborate plumage during the breeding season, again, to attract mates. And then the smaller wading birds actually have plumage that helps them camouflage. So that's another thing about the anatomy of these birds is their plumage in terms of either camouflaging or attracting mates. Moving on, talk a little bit about diet. And this diet's gonna, like I said, differs from species to species, but they all kind of, especially the ones here in South Florida, have a pretty consistent diet. And it does range from species to species, but a lot of them are feeding on fish, crustaceans, mollusks, amphibians, small insects, lizards. There's a variety of smaller invertebrates that these birds are looking for when they're wading through the water. They don't get all their food from the water, though. There are some that, again, they're feeding along our shorelines, or even in the habitats that border our wetlands. So, they might find frogs or small insects on the shoreline or in the sediment along the shoreline. So it's not primarily aquatic species. And again, like we said, their bills actually do help them. And you'll see these pictures here give you a better idea when I talked about the bills, how they're able to grasp at some of the prey that they're looking to get. So a little bit more about habitat. Again, we talked about wetlands and the importance to these wading birds, but a little bit more about where these wetlands are and how South Florida is this great place for them. So again, they're naturally adapted to these areas with standing water, but also areas with moving water like streams, estuaries. These habitats are diverse. They also move inland too when they're not, foraging in the water. A lot of their nesting and foraging and rookeries are inland. So you will find them in these places like salt marshes, meadows, coastal marshes, mangroves, and these other estuarine environments. And you'll also find them in upland forest communities. Again, we'll talk about later on, but they find these areas to roost, when they're not foraging, and also to create their nests. And so these habitats, not just these wet habitats, but dry habitats are important to these wading birds. And just a little bit of mention of wetlands. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of their threats, but as we all know, wetlands have been, seriously, damaged and converted A lot of these areas, especially in the early 1900s in South Florida, were seen as wastelands, not areas that were important for our survival as well as these animals. And so a lot of these areas were drained. And that's not just here in Florida, but across the United States. Actually, more than half of the United States' original wetland acreage has been converted to other land uses in the last 2 centuries. So, you can imagine just how much less area there is for these species. So let's talk a little bit more about these species and kind of look at our cast of characters here in South Florida. And again, South Florida really has a wide variety, and it represents, or at least a lot of these varieties of wading birds around the world are represented here in South Florida. This image kind of gives you an idea of just the variety of, we look at morphology, coloration, these beaks. So this slide kind of has it all. And so we're going to talk about kind of the groups of these and how they kind of are grouped by name. And again, there are 18 species found in South Florida. And, we talked about kind of their habitat. I want to single out, the Everglades ecosystem, because that's really where you're going to see, all these birds living side by side. And again, in the 1800s, these species were much more well represented. James Audubon, the Audubon Society is named after him. He wrote during his visit to South Florida in 1806 the following. He said, "We observed great flocks of wading birds flying overhead towards their evening roosts. They appeared in such numbers to actually block out the light of the sun for some time." So that just gives you an idea of just the variety and the numbers that used to exist in this ecosystem. So before we jump into each one of these characters, I'd like to ask you guys to answer another poll question. Anna's going to launch that. Thank you. So which one of what is the most common wading bird found in South Florida? I listed 4 here. There's the great egret, the great blue heron, the roseate spoonbill, and the white ibis. Which one do you think is the most common? Give that a couple more seconds. Good. Looks like a lot of you got the right answer here. So we're going to end that poll. So if you chose D, white ibis, you are correct. And so we'll start off with our ibis. Quite a charismatic species. If you're from South Florida, you know our local football team, the Miami Hurricanes. Our mascot for the University of Miami is the white ibis. And that really comes from, kind of this story about our white ibis is that, they're sentinel birds in the sense that here in South Florida, our hurricane season, when these storms are coming through, the white ibis are actually the last bird to leave before the storm and the first ones to return after the storm. So they kind of got that association with our hurricane season and became that mascot. But the white ibis itself, you'll see he, has that white plumage, very bright white plumage, and that strikingly red, those legs and that long curved bill. And then they have these really bright bluish green eyes that really are quite striking if you see them up close. And these adult birds, you'll often see them, in great flocks. Oftentimes they're flying from their roosts to foraging grounds at dawn and dusk. And again, they're the most common found. They're not just, out in the Everglades, but they're often found in people's backyards. They have kind of adapted to, foraging in people's lawns, as well as, along canals and lakes. And so you'll see this bird quite often. A relative of it, one that you maybe see less common, is the glossy ibis. This one has like a dark reddish brown neck and head, but up close and in light, it actually is quite iridescent. So you'll start to see maroons and greens and blues. this picture really doesn't do it justice, but that glossy ibis, you know, again, same sort of morphology. They are hunting similar to the white ibis. They kind of probe the ground with that long, slender bill. And again, their numbers are a little bit less, smaller populations here in South Florida, but they also are a South Florida native. Then we have the limpkin. This one is a little bit different. It's more related to, it's kind of in its own category actually, but it's similar in its foraging. And here in South Florida, what's unique about the limpkin is that it's actually adapted to feed on our apple snails. So apple snails are a mollusk that is found in the Everglades. And you can tell the limpkin's bill is very long and pointy. And so these limpkins will actually be able to remove the snail from the shell. So they're very adapted to feed on these apple snails. And so the limpkin, again, is in that same kind of category in terms of the morphology and the way that they feed. Next, we have our egrets. So this one is probably, again, you know, our most recognizable. It's the symbol for the great egret is our symbol for the Audubon Society. And you might have seen egrets here in South Florida, and sometimes it can be hard to distinguish what kind of egret you're actually seeing. And so here I have 4 egrets that we see here in South Florida. The most abundant that we see here, and actually the largest of the egrets, we'll start with the great egret here. It's quite a large bird. It's not as large as the largest wading bird, which is the great blue heron, which is the next category we'll get into. But this one has a yellow bill and long black legs. And oftentimes you'll see this one at dawn and dusk. Again, they feed both, you see them often on our shorelines as well, on our coastlines. And they kind of, again, you'll be able to distinguish them. They're much larger than the other 2 white plumaged egrets, or the snowy and the cattle. But again, that one is quite large. And then so you have the cattle egret, which is the one on the right here. This one is pretty easy to distinguish because it has this kind of like brownish yellow plumage, which you'll see year round. And it sits smaller and more like squats. So they're much, they're much smaller than the other 2 egrets, the snowy and the great. And the other thing about the cattle egret, it gets its name because it's often found in areas that are, you know, more urbanized and in our agricultural areas. So they get their name because they often follow larger mammals, things like especially cattle, but, you know, in the past, you know, other grassland mammals that would move through and stir up the ground. And these cattle egrets will just kind of pop behind and feed on the insects or the other invertebrates that are stirred up. So this one you'll see both in the wetland areas as well as in these drier agricultural areas. And then lastly, the snowy egret here of the white plumaged egrets. This one has a different bill than the great and the cattle. It has this black bill, and then it has these yellow feet with black legs. So those are kind of ways that you can tell these 3 apart, are their legs and their toes, and then the color of their bills as well. And then lastly, the reddish egret. This one is very distinct. It has that brownish red neck, and then this bluish gray back. This one's a little bit more uncommon here in South Florida as far as the other 3 egrets are concerned. But this one definitely stands out. Moving on to herons. As I mentioned, the great blue heron is our largest wading bird. Very stately. You'll find them, again, just like the great egret, in these coastline areas, as well as in these freshwater habitats. This species is very widespread, not just in South Florida, but across the United States. It's about 40 inches in length, has a very large wingspan. It's mostly gray in color. Sometimes the juveniles can be a whitish, which can be confusing in terms of identifying them between the egret and the heron. But they have this distinct, when they're adults, have this distinct kind of grayish neck, very long neck, this little black feather off the back, and then this bluish gray tail feathers. And so these great blue herons, are often seen year-round in our South Florida wetlands. They're not migratory. Then we have two smaller herons. The three smaller herons. We have the green heron. Oops. Sorry about that. The green heron. This heron is often seen. It's locally common. It's about 14 inches long. It has this very cool coloration. It's got this tan kind of rust color on the breast, this very unique yellow along the eye, and then this greenish color over here. They kind of like to sit along our mangroves and kind of in the shrubbery along the shoreline. They don't really wade out into the water. You can tell they have kind of shorter legs here, and this one's roosting on a mangrove root. These guys are kind of waiting for prey to come by and striking out and grabbing that fish as it moves underneath those mangroves. The tricolored heron is a very, sorry, this one doesn't have a label, but the tricolored heron is a very, very pretty color. It's got this, the tricolors, the three colors are kind of this blue, the purple, and then kind of almost like an orangish yellow. And then they have this like reddish eye. So they're very unique. And they can be distinguished from the great blue heron just by the size. There are about half the size of those great blue herons. And then you have the little blue heron, which is the smallest of those, the great and the tri and the little. And they have a greenish yellow legs and then a purplish blue neck. And so the tricolored heron and the little blue heron are often found both in the mangroves and in the shrubbery along the coastline, as well as wading out into the water. Continuing with our herons, we have two other herons that are quite distinctive. These guys are different in their behavior and then the time that they're foraging, as well as in their appearance. So these two are night herons. So we have the black crowned night heron and the yellow crowned night heron. They're rather stockier in the build than the typical herons that we saw on the last slide. They have shorter necks and shorter, thicker bills. They're called night herons because of their habit of fishing. They're mostly fishing after the hours of darkness. And again, they can be seen in the daytime, but they're most active during the night as well as at dawn and dusk. Oftentimes you'll see yellow-crowned night herons actually on our beaches. They're often found feeding on ghost crabs and sea turtle hatchlings. They have this very distinct like reddish eye, and then they have this feather that kind of extends from the edge of their bill all the way back to the neckline. And so these guys their hunting style is kind of motionless. So they'll kind of sit in front of their prey or in an area that they know prey will come through, and they'll just wait. They'll wait until, I've seen them waiting there for, up to an hour, just waiting for their prey to come through. It's interesting to watch these guys along our beaches waiting for a ghost crab to come out of its hole. And again, these birds, they have very distinct facial markings. So, unlike the other herons, they have these these kind of two-tone underneath their eyes. They have this white and black. Same with the black-crowned night heron. Again, they're easier to camouflage at night, in the shrubbery and in the areas that they're foraging and waiting for prey to come by. Then we move on to bitterns. So these are actually similar to our herons. They're the smallest herons in the world. So they're going to be, just about 13, 14 inches. And you can tell they have very short and stout necks. And most often they're going to be in the brush. They're going to be living kind of along, reeds and grasses. And they're clinging to like the long stems. They have really long toes, which help them cling to these really fragile grasses and shoots. And they kind of like to hide out. Their nests are in like tangled vegetation. And again, they sit slightly hunched and they have those sharp beaks. So they're able to really reach out of that grass and grab things. So they kind of like to conceal themselves. They, you can see their camouflage. They kind of like to be, or they hide out in this, you know, the dense dry foliage. So they're kind of this tan brown color, and they have the American bittern has this like mottled color where it really helps them blend in. But again, their bodies are very compact, and when they spread their wings, the wingtips are very pointed because they're trying to, you know, move through the brush pretty quietly. And then lastly, we have three birds that, again, are charismatic. We do see these represented quite a bit in our media. But let's start with the most beautiful of the three, the roseate spoonbill. Gorgeous at a distance, kind of bizarre up close if you look at its face. They're locally common, not just here in Florida, but Texas and Southwest Louisiana as well. And they're usually in small flocks. So they're often associated with, other waders. So they're wading through, with these other herons and egrets. But they feed in that shallow water, like I mentioned earlier, with those spoon-like, spatula-like beaks, moving from side to side, just kind of opening and closing them, sifting through that muck. They do nest here in South Florida along Flamingo area down in the Everglades. That area is a really important nesting site for them, and we'll talk more a little bit about nesting after this. And then we have our sandhill crane. These are very prehistoric looking. Again, they kind of fall more into the crane variety, but here we often, in South Florida, we find them associating with our water birds, or our wading birds. And so they're feeding not just in our grasslands, but also in our wetland areas. What sandhill cranes can be year-round residents as well as migratory. We do have both here in South Florida. And you'll definitely hear them from a distance. They make these really loud squawking calls. A lot of people think they sound like velociraptors, from Jurassic Park, but they are very tall. They're quite large. They're a little bit larger than the great blue herons. Then we have this kind of odd looking bird, the wood stork. It's kind of our only native stork in North America, actually. It has a heavy bill that it uses. It wades in the shallows, kind of like the spoonbill, moving from side to side, sifting through that sediment. They have a very noisy call as well. They kind of also hiss, and they clap their bills, which can be heard from a ways away. And this species, both the wood stork and the roseate spoonbill, we'll talk about in terms of they're kind of that harbinger of threats to the ecosystems that they live in. They're kind of that sentinel species, which we'll talk about when it comes to threats to their environment. So I'd be amiss not to talk about, we have a lot of threats to them currently, but really the populations in South Florida of these birds, have been threatened because of what happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s. In those days, tens of millions of birds were taken, actually at the height of what was really popular in that day and age, which was to adorn your hats with feathers. Between 1870 and 1920, again, tens of millions of birds, a lot of them from the oops. I'm sorry. So that slide is a little off, but the plumage hunting, again, from the more than 1 million herons and egrets were sold in London from 1897 to 1911. A lot of these species, there was an open season on them. So they could come, hunters could come, they could shoot them out of the trees, they could shoot them as they're, flying overhead. And they could harvest the plumes, but they also left behind the skin carcasses, and they often left the young to fend for themselves. And a lot of them died of starvation. But really, I mean, that fad kind of lasted for 40, 50 years, but it really led to, a formation of this conservation effort. And a lot of that was what founded societies like the Audubon Society, because they did believe that public perception was changing, and that these hunting regulations needed to be implemented in order to preserve these species. And it really was one of the first conservation initiatives here in South Florida. And it took some effort from these people of societal and political prominence to enable the passage of these laws, but they became what was the origin of a lot of the protections that we have today, things like the Endangered Species Act, to protect America's wildlife. So that being said, I want to talk a little bit about rookeries. We mentioned how there's these areas that these birds congregate, which made it really easy for these hunters to hunt for them, and that's when these birds were resting. So rookeries are areas where these birds go when they're not foraging. So they are usually in colonies that often include a variety of species. They're not just single species, but a variety that are again, they find areas in trees and in the forest that are adjacent to these wetlands. And these colonies have advantages, safety in numbers. There's also, they find areas that are close to their foraging grounds, so the food supply is good. And because they're also needing areas to nest, these nesting birds need to be sedentary. Finding areas up in trees and in these shrubberies, makes them less vulnerable to predators. So, in these areas where there's, quite a bit of nesting happening, they're finding those areas in those trees to be safe from predators. And also, with lots of birds in one place, each individual has a better chance of escaping than if they were on their own, nesting on their own. There's also, again, safety in numbers in the sense that there's birds that, when they sense danger, they can alarm and sound alarm to the other birds that are in that area. And so they are able to also join forces and help drive that predator away. So these rookeries are really important. And when we talk about preserving habitat, we need to find and study these areas where they also are roosting and where they're nesting. So nesting happens, it varies depending on the species, but a lot of the nesting is happening here in South Florida in the springtime, so around this time. And as I said, they find these areas depending on the species. Some like to be lower to the ground, others higher in the shrubs. And that's where they build their nests, and they can build them out of a variety of materials, sticks, reeds, things, branches. Some just like to put them in a pile of leaves. It really depends on the species. But again, they're looking for those areas that are safe from predators. And March is actually a very important time. The bulk of the egg laying activity happens right around now. It can happen earlier, but in the southern portion of the state, it's the best time before the rainy season comes and the water levels rise. They're finding time to raise their young. And those nests can be scattered across the state. Again, I mentioned the roseate spoonbill is a charismatic species we find nesting down in South Florida near Flamingo. And again, after the breeding season, they disperse kind of widely around the state. That nesting, again, is important when we talk about conserving habitat. These birds need to find areas where they have access to their foraging grounds so they can feed their young. And so, this cycle from year to year, there's quite a few different areas that these birds utilize. And so this is just an image from 2015 of just the wading bird nesting areas within the region. And as you'll see, it's areas that are quite segmented due to the management agencies and the different protections in these regions. So, we're looking at the southern portion of the state, mostly in the Everglades region. So, we have Lake Okeechobee just below the word nesting. And in the natural ecosystem, that water flow from the Lake Okeechobee would flow over the river of grass, over these prairies of sawgrass, and through these tree islands down into Florida Bay. And so this slow moving water was the perfect environment for these wading birds. And And so that historically was the most important region. Of course, we've got wetland areas along either side of the state as well, but this was the main catchment area for our wading birds. And their nesting sites, you'll see, are scattered around. And today, you know, these areas are fragmented, and there's much smaller areas for nesting due to the changing of that habitat. So we talked a little bit about the plumage hunting and how that threat really decimated these populations, and how you know, conservation efforts have brought these populations to a more stable state, not back to the levels that they were pre-1800s. But today, as I just mentioned, with their habitat, we're starting to see a lot more threats kind of cause them to be in harm's way. So we did talk about habitat destruction, mainly that drainage. So you'll see, you know, in these images, we've channelized this ecosystem, the Everglades ecosystem. So we've turned these areas of slow-moving water, areas where water would sit on the land for days on end, in shallow, kind of marshy-like conditions that were perfect for these birds to wade through, have now become very deep, channelized waterways. And we've done that. I mean, that started, you know, really in the 1930s to channelize the Everglades. We were building canals to feed into our metropolitan areas, to our agricultural areas, drying up this area for development, as well as for agricultural practices to reach that really rich soil beneath. And so because of that, we've found these areas to be very dry, even during the wet season. And this water just moves right off the land very quickly, very swiftly, and doesn't allow that water to sit there and not only filter, but provide that habitat for the birds. So all those hydrological alterations have caused the area for the birds to survive to shrink. And we can also talk about, you know, threats to the water by not just the quantity, but the quality. So that water is much more polluted. There's a lot more both chemical as well as physical pollutants that are in our waterways. And it also, water quality can also be talked about in terms of you know, how that water is filtered over the land. So again, there's not a lot of time for that water to be filtered by the natural wetland plants. And then lastly, climate change is also altering both water availability as well as saltwater intrusion. So we talk about climate change and sea level rise, especially down in Florida Bay. On that last slide down here, with sea level rise, we're seeing saltwater infiltrate these areas that were once more fresh, which can also alter the quality and the timing and the flow and that habitat for these birds. So that being said, you know, Florida has, you know, there's a lot of alterations being made in the Everglades. You know, we're looking to move that system back to what it used to be, or at least something like it, in terms of having that water move slowly across the plain and allowing that water to sit there. We've done projects like they just finished portions of raising the Tamiami Trail to allow that water to flow into Everglades National Park, which is really helping to allow that water flow to make it to these areas that have really become, you know, not suitable for these birds. So projects like that are helping. But it's also on, you know, on us living in these urban environments, living near water. We love to share that, you know, that water with these animals. And it's really important that we know how to share it. You know, it's staying away from these nesting areas, keeping that water quality, fighting for you know, water regulations and ways to help restore that natural flow and to clean up our waterways. But it's also helping to protect the birds themselves and their food supply. So, you know, in terms of you know, these birds feeding on these natural, you know, fish that grow up in places like the mangroves and in these ecosystems that border our waterways, that's important as well, because it's all interconnected in terms of the greater landscape. So really the survival of these species is really, you know, on us. We have the tools, we do have the science and the expertise, but as a society, we need to have that sustained commitment to ensure that not just these species, but all these other, you know, South Florida species are, you know, are able to thrive here in South Florida. So another way that you can help in this effort is also with bird counts. We find out a lot about these birds and what habitats they're utilizing, how they're doing by counting them. So there's a lot of citizen science efforts here in South Florida, annual bird counts that actually give scientists and some of these resource managers a better idea of how these species are doing. So if you look into the Audubon Society, they have Christmas bird counts. They have a great backyard bird count. These are happening throughout, mostly during this season when there's more bird life down here in South Florida. But those are ways that you can just count birds in your local area and help, you know, this greater effort to you know, quantify and see how the quality of the life of these birds. So lastly, I just want to talk about birding as a hobby and, you know, ways in which you can support, you know, birds here in South Florida and places that you can go and see some of these variety of birds. So there's nothing easier to see really, I guess, from a wildlife point of view than, you know, some of these wading birds, which, you know, inhabit quite a few ecosystems in our backyard. You know, the water really attracts them like a magnet, as we discussed. All kind of their life cycle depends on it. And because we're attracted to the water, these birds frequently become accustomed to the presence of people. You know, this plus the confidence that they have a ready escape route either by air or by water, you know, they're more likely to be approachable or at least photographable, you know, from a short distance. So all you really need is, you know, a camera or your phone, and a decent bird guide helps. There's quite a few bird books out there. Smithsonian makes one, the Audubon Society, of course, and so you can pick up one of those online. And then also, you know, good pair of binoculars also helps in case, you know, there's birds that are a little farther away. But there's some great spots here in South Florida. Of course, Everglades National Park, like we talked about. We have the Anhinga Trail, is a great place to see a variety, as well as some of our other birds like the Anhinga. The Flamingo area in the southern portion, again, that's an area important for nesting. This time of year, you'll see quite a few of them in those ponds and lakes near Flamingo. Shark Valley is a great place to go for a bike ride, you know, right along the prairie, the sawgrass prairie there. Lots of birds. Big Cypress has Loop Road, another area that is quite right out there in the middle of the Everglades. And then one that's a little bit more urban that not a lot of people know about is Wakota-Hatchie Wetlands. It's up in Delray Beach. It's this small acreage, but they've really done a good job at preserving and restoring some of these coastal wetlands that we don't, you know, see as often. These transverse glades, which we call them, that kind of in the past would be between the Everglades and the coastal eco estuary. And so that's a great place as well. So with that, I have one last poll for you guys. If you don't mind just telling us a little bit more about, you know, where you're watching from and how many of you. So the first question is your agreement with the following statement: I learned something from this webinar. Let us know how we did. And then we have how many are watching. So that's including you, not how many in this total in this webinar right now, but how many are with you in the room. And then lastly, if you scroll down, the third question is where are you viewing from? Take a minute for that. Thank you.
I'm gonna hop on real quick and just say thank you so much to Ed for that fantastic presentation. I learned a lot. I will be the first to admit that birds are not my strong suit. So it was nice to have a focus group to look at and start to practice some of the identification techniques that he talked about. So thank you, Ed. It was really great.
No problem.
We want to thank you all.
Yeah, go ahead, Anna.
Sorry, no, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who is online and listening. We really appreciate you staying on and supporting not just Ed's program today, but this entire effort of conservation conversations. And if you have to hop off, no problem. We recognize it's a little bit past 12:30, so if you have to leave, please don't stress. We will be making this presentation available on YouTube, and Ed will be sending that out in the next few days. So Ed, we're gonna go ahead with the cute question and answer session. And
Sure.
if you have any questions for Ed, please go ahead and throw them in the chat box. And I'm gonna start with a question from our friend Anthony.
Hey, Anthony.
Anthony wanted to know if you will see wading birds near the alligators in Everglades National Park.
Yeah, so wading birds are usually, that is one of their predators, but you'll very much see them side by side in a lot of these environments. They kind of frequent the same places. The alligators are oftentimes right along the shoreline and moving into that shallower water where they can, warm themselves up. And so the wading birds are often right alongside them. But again, they are a predator. So when it comes time to nest or roost, they're oftentimes up in the trees away from these alligators. But in terms of like foraging, they oftentimes are foraging right along near them, but at a safe distance. Thanks for that question, Anthony.
Gotcha. Marcia's asking, is the great egret also known as a great white heron?
So I've heard that been called that before, but the great egret, and again, that's not the appropriate term for them, just because the difference between the herons and egrets, but yes, I have heard that. But yeah, the great egret is a separate, and again, the distinguishing qualities between the two being the coloration, but the beak and the feet are ways, and the legs, you can tell the difference between them.
I've also heard that the great blue heron can have a white phase. And so
yeah,
that's what's often confused as a great white heron. It's not two separate species, but rather the same species, just with different plumage.
Yeah, the plumage could be a little bit different. Yeah, and some of these varieties do have juvenile plumage that can be oftentimes confused. So yeah, that would be one thing to distinguish between them.
Cool. There was another comment, and I'm glad to see you brought up the Cotahatchee wetlands, because Marcia commented to me that wood storks are multitudinous at Cotahatchee wetlands, and they are nesting there in Palm Beach County.
It's really, the wood stork is really kind of a more of a conservation success. They are listed as an endangered species, but we've seen, especially with some of these restoration efforts, the wood storks respond quite well, especially with the nesting. In last year's assessment of nesting in the Everglades, they saw quite a rise in the nesting for the wood storks. Again, that's after some of these efforts to bring more water to the park. And so again, these birds, it's good to see that nesting happening, not just in these regions like Everglades, but in these smaller wetland areas up in Palm Beach County. And I know Palm Beach County, the Environmental Resource Management, has done a lot to build habitat and to provide areas in their natural. They have a lot of natural area space up there specifically for wood storks. So that's really good to see.
If I can also add on to that, I don't think you talked about sandhill cranes, and I don't think they're considered a wading bird, but we do often see them in wetland areas. And in fact, up in the Okeechobee area, there are some dairy farms that have actually integrated wetland features into their farms, and now have tons of birds, including sandhill cranes, that are now using those corridors, if you will, for foraging, which is really interesting to see.
That's a good point. Yeah. So yeah, I kind of included sandhill cranes in this presentation because, again, here in South Florida, that population does spend quite a bit of time foraging kind of along the wetlands. And like you said, those areas, those prairies, those agricultural areas adjacent to these bodies of water are important for them because their nesting happens in those areas. And so, you know, whereas some of the populations in Canada, some of these migratory populations, you know, they're nesting, or they don't spend a lot of time in these wetland areas. But it's unique here in South Florida. We see these sandhill cranes oftentimes, you know, waiting right alongside our herons and our egrets. So yeah, that's another, you know, conservation easement is one area that I've seen with sandhill cranes, is to, you know, have this private land that they've been able to attract sandhill cranes, and by association other wading birds, by creating habitat specifically for them.
Really cool. Thanks, Ed. All right, last call for any questions for Ed. If not, I will thank you all again for attending and remind you that our April conservation conversation on Wednesday the 14th will be about the Miami blue butterfly. And I do want to apologize for those who are on the email sign-up list. I forgot to send the email to the regular recipients, reminding them of the topic and the sign-up. So I'm putting my email address in the chat. If you would like to be on our sign-up list, feel free to just let me know and I can add you, and you can receive an email reminder with the topic and the registration link for the month. So we look forward to seeing you next month.
Thank you all for joining today.
Yeah.
I hope you are able to get out and see some birds. Great time to go see a lot of these species that we talked about today. So hope you guys are able to get out.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks so much. Bye.